The following podcast is not relating to my teachings and work at Del Cedar Medical Center and is for entertainment purposes only. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Life of Flow podcast. Today we have another very interesting episode, kind of off the path as far as topics. We have Amy Sandler. Amy is a Harvard Business School graduate. She is a professional speaker, mindfulness trainer, and executive coach, and works with the concept of radical candor and how to apply it in the business setting, in the work setting, especially we're going to talk about the healthcare setting in order to establish high-performing teams and what that means and what that process entails. So it's very interesting. Any comments, Miguel?
Oh, another one of those that I just love because it's like free advice.
Yeah, it's like free company. Consulting for Hope Vascular.
Keep racking them up. And anytime anybody can bring advice on building teams, I am going to gobble it up. So thank you for doing that. That was a great guest. And we look forward to having more conversations with her or her team in the future.
All right. Vamos. Thank you, everyone. Vamos.
Two vascular surgeons walk into a bar and come out with a podcast. We are talking everything vascular and not. Welcome to the Life of Flow podcast.
Would you mind giving our audience a brief intro into yourself, your career, your passion, and your area of interest?
Absolutely. First of all, great to be with you both today. And my background is more in the business setting. I have an MBA from Harvard Business School. I also went on the income minimization path after business school. My friends were going into something called the internet. I don't know if you heard of it. It seems to have turned out well for them. I decided to go to film school. I got a Master of Fine Arts in screenwriting. And then I became a meditation teacher. But somehow it's all paid off because all those things that seemed very far afield from business are now really critical to creativity, to innovation, teamwork, and performance. And so the piece that I think really threaded that all together was a program that I did about 10 years ago. I became one of the first teachers of a program called Search Inside Yourself. It was developed at Google, and it was a leadership development program at Google. And the idea was, how can we teach engineers to develop more leadership, and using mindfulness and the latest in neuroscience, which at that time was pretty cutting edge. The idea was that you can actually, through practicing mindfulness, develop the self-awareness that you need to develop emotional intelligence. And so I started teaching mindfulness, emotional intelligence in the workplace. I've been doing that about 10 years. And for the last 7 years, like you mentioned, I've been working at a company called Radical Candor. Radical Candor is an executive education company based on a best-selling book by a woman named Kim Scott. She had been at Apple and at Google and coaches CEOs. And she wrote this book about 7 years ago. And it got really quite successful, this idea that to succeed at work, you really need to care about the people you work with at the same time you're willing to challenge them. The reason why it's called Radical Candor is that it's rare that we have that kind of candor in the workplace. We tend to either sort of not say the thing because we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, or we end up going so directly at the people that we work with, we're sort of acting like a jerk. And what's radical is that we can be both compassionate and candid at the same time. So I've been at Radical Candor now about 7 years. I've been the chief marketing officer and chief content officer, and now I'm primarily focused on our coaching, overseeing our coaching programs, as well as our podcast.
So how many people work at Radical Candor?
We're a small company. We've got about probably 6 or 7 full-time employees, and then we've got about 9 coaches who are sharing Radical Candor through workshops, through keynotes. When I first started, actually, there was an initial incarnation of Radical Candor that Kim Scott started with Russ Laraway. Kim and Russ had worked together. And like any Silicon Valley story, Kim gave a talk that went viral. And And this was before the book even came out, the book Radical Candor. And so all these folks were throwing money at her to build an app. And so they created a company to create an app for feedback. This was a bit ahead of its time. And so Radical Candor became more of a coaching, training company. And what's been really interesting the past couple of years, as we're seeing more advancements with AI and technology, the development of tools using AI to help practice feedback, et cetera. So we're primarily in person and virtual sessions, and also developing some AI practice partners as well.
The concept of feedback seems to be pretty prevalent especially in academic medicine. We have these 360 reviews. Did you guys have that at Baylor?
I don't remember doing that.
Yeah, we actually had them in residency, and now we have them when we're faculty. And it's interesting, but they don't seem very actionable. And I know this is kind of a tangent, but is there a way to, how do you take information that kind of seems out of context and with no clear pathway to implement a change if there is a critique? Like, how do you take that as an individual, as a leader in your particular area of an institution, and take it to heart and take it for your own improvement?
It's a great question. I think the word feedback, we struggle with the word feedback because it can bring up a lot of things, at least in the business world. Some people, we go right to thinking it's criticism. Some people get really nervous about feedback. Some people see it as growth, et cetera. We certainly see that we need to have feedback to grow. And so if we pull the lens back a little bit, when I talk about radical candor, what I'm really talking about is relationship building radically candid relationships with the people that we work with. And Kim wrote the book Radical Candor primarily focused for managers, because we've got to counteract the power imbalance. So I could see if we are, leading an academic institution, if we are leading a surgical team, there is inherently a power imbalance. And so the first thing that any leader needs to do to create more safety and to start to build this kind of relationship is to actually solicit feedback, to ask for feedback. And these kinds of questions, and we could sort of brainstorm the kinds of questions maybe that you and Miguel ask each other, that you could ask people that are, working with you in the OR. The kinds of questions that we might ask in a more business setting would be something like, what's something in the last week that you wish I hadn't done, or that you wish I had done? What's one way I got in the way in working with you last week? I could even do at the end of this conversation that we're having, hey, Lucas, what's one thing that you wish I had responded more succinctly on, or you wish that I had addressed more clearly? Or what's one way I could have explained that concept more clearly to your listeners, right? So we're constantly looking for ways that we can improve. And this can fall under two things. One is behavior and one is work product. So behavior could be, for example, let's say we're in meetings, and I know I tend to talk a lot in meetings. I could say to someone in that meeting after the meeting, or I could even say before the meeting, I'd say, hey, Lucas, hey, Miguel, it's really important to me that everyone feels like they have a voice on this team. And so I know my tendency is to talk a lot in meetings. What I'd love to do is at the end of the meeting, check in with you and see how I could have been even more inclusive, or when did I jump in when it would have been more helpful for me to stay quiet and let more introverted folks jump in, and then check in at the end of the meeting. So that's kind of thing one, is to actually ask for feedback. Now, the thing is, some people might like a more open question, like what's one thing that I could do to make it easier for us to talk, for us to communicate better, for us to work better together. Some people might like a more kind of specific question, like about the meeting or about in that last procedure, what's one way we could have improved, or what's one thing that you wish I hadn't done in that setup to the procedure. And so part of it's going to be about finding questions that get you the feedback that you're looking for. And I'll pause with that there and see how that lands.
Well, I wanted to ask, like, who should be seeking radical candor, right? I mean, who's the best target? to say, we've got, I would say, mid-career people that follow us within a very micro atmosphere of cardiovascular medicine, both physicians, but also people within industry. For all those about 5,000 people that are out there that listen to us, who would you say, you know what, there's some goodness in you considering looking at into what this concept, what this ethos, what this culture means? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm biased, but it's for everyone, really. And the reason why it's for everyone, I believe, is because underneath all of this is that if you believe that we want to grow, we want to be the best possible version of ourselves, the best possible leader, the best possible founder, the best possible surgeon, we all have blind spots or those areas that we're not aware. If we believe that we had to do, we could just do it all ourselves, then we would. Even if we are a founder, an entrepreneur, we all need other parts to fill us out. We all sort of have these potential blind spots or areas to grow. So A, I think it's for everyone, and then B, it's really about, as an individual, starting to develop more of these one-on-one relationships. So you can look at the people that you work most closely with, especially if you are a leader. As a mid-career person, you might be, I think, in some of the toughest situation, which is you have to manage upward, sideways, downward, all sorts of different levels. And so it can always be a little bit different when we're managing kind of upwards versus with a peer versus somebody that reports to us. If it's somebody that reports to us, it's even more important that you start by asking for criticism, because you've got to lay the inherent power down. I mean, even just think about it for yourself going through your own career, who you might have felt more or less safe with in providing your perspective, especially if it's criticism. And I think it's also really important to say that feedback is not just criticism. It's both praise and criticism. And in fact, specific and sincere praise, not like, hey, great job there, or love being on the podcast, you guys are great. Like, that is not helpful praise. What is helpful praise is saying, hey, Miguel, when you ask that question, I'm starting to learn more about your audience. And so it enables me to be even more specific and more clear in the stories that I'm telling or the content that I'm sharing. It's really important for me that people really get this and it's relevant for them. So thank you for telling me a bit more about that. And I can share with you the actual model that we use for feedback, for guidance. It's adapted from a model that comes from the Center for Creative Leadership. Their model is called SBI. We've broadened it out to something we call CORE, context, observation, result, and next step. Anybody think, oh, that should be corn? And we thought about that, but then we were going to make like corny jokes. And so anyhow, you can call it that. But you think about like, what is the context of the situation? And so I can give like a business situation, but maybe as I go through this, think about what would be an example in either in a surgical setting or even amongst the two of you, running this podcast. So maybe the context in my world could be in the quarterly budget review meeting with the CFO. So that might be a context. You might have your context as, hey, and setting up for today's podcast, right? And then what's the observation? This is really important. We call this an observation because so often what makes feedback land in a way that is either not clear or even kind of obnoxious is saying, you're a genius or you're an idiot. We sort of personalize the feedback. We're making a judgment. And what we really want to do is take it out of judgment and say, here's what I observed. So an example of praise could be, I observed that there was an analysis in your deck. It was complex and it was accurate. So there was an accurate analysis. That would be kind of the work product part of it. So maybe, I don't know, in an OR, it's like the cutting of the suture was clean. I don't know what and then maybe there's also a behavior associated with that. So the CFO asked you a follow-up question and you were able to answer succinctly. Right. So that's what I observed. I'm not making kind of a judgment. I'm just saying there was a complex, accurate analysis, or you answered the question succinctly. Do you have, just for example, do you have one that comes to mind of like an observation of something that went well, either in a surgery or, setting up for the podcast? What would the example be?
I mean, that's what I find difficult, and I sometimes think it's like we're both like Latin, Hispanic. I'm from Puerto Rico. Miguel's from Costa Rica, and there is a sort of dryness to the way that you're explaining that doesn't resonate with.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like my Puerto Ricanness, my Latinness, because the way like we relate
Okay.
is very informal, and we communicate things that matter, like to set up for this podcast in a very
Yeah.
informal way, and there is tension in the way that Miguel and I communicate, but there is an implicit trust and there's like an implicit relationship, and
I didn't know there was tension between us.
I think like we
Yeah,
communicate with tension.
Really?
Yeah, sometimes. Come on.
Okay.
Anyways,
we're going to get back into that.
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
go back into that.
Yeah.
I think we have to explore it.
I'm going to go through the very formal framework and then we're going to unpack the tension. But yes,
Yeah.
continue, Lucas.
And then in the operating room, you deal with all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds.
Yep.
And the way you communicate, the way you give praise, the way that you give criticism, I also do it in a very informal way, and I feel like it comes off genuine, and it feels like people respond to that to me. So in that way, so I don't know. Sometimes when I hear these mental models of going through problems or going through these type of criticism, praise, interactions, it feels foreign. It feels like it's not implementable in the real world. When it come in at 7:30 on a Wednesday, it doesn't feel like it lands. I don't know. That's just kind of a general idea.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think, one of the things that is really important in what you said is that radical candor is measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. And so what I think is kind and clear is going to look different for you, is going to look different for Miguel, et cetera. And so one of the things that we do is we share stories of a time when we received radical candor to kind of share what it looks like, explain what it looks like. The model that I was going through, and I can just wrap that up so folks are aware what it is. How you actually say it, you can start to put it in your own words. But I think what's important about the model, context, observation, result, and next steps, is what we're actually trying to communicate. So how you say it, the words you use to do it, and then the impact of how you say it to the other person, those are all like people will often want sort of a script, and we will say this isn't about giving someone a script. The mental model is there to guide people and then to actually have the conversation, to your point, in a way that's much more relational and back and forth. But just to flesh out the framework, and then we'll get back into sort of the human and the measurement part of it is so. Just as the example, the context was a meeting. The observation was the deck was accurate. The result, this is really where it matters. Why is what I'm saying important to the other person? Do I know this other person well enough to know why it matters? Maybe the most important result is we're going to get the funding request. Maybe the most important result is you're on track for a promotion. Maybe the most important result in a conversation that you and Miguel had is that we were able to do this episode of the podcast on time. I was worried we were running late, but because we did X, Y, and Z, as a result, we're on time, right? So what is the key result here? Very often, people start getting into it's this and it's this and it's this. There is an element of clarity of why this matters to you and to the team and to the other person. And then this next step is also important. Because if it's criticism, we want to have a path forward. We might not need to know every next step. As a next step, let's meet next Tuesday and talk about, how we could have planned for the podcast more efficiently next time. Let's say you're debriefing and there was a miscommunication and we ended up starting late. So, hey, let's meet next Tuesday. Let's figure out where we got off track in our communication, right? So next step could be like that. A next step for praise could be, hey, do the exact same thing in the meeting with the CEO next week, or show the team how you did that thing. So I think the value of a model is more to show people when I am giving guidance or feedback, am I sharing with them the context, what I observed, why it matters, and how we're going to keep moving forward? So that's where that can be helpful. I think in terms of how things land and our background is hugely important. There is no absolute measure of radical candor. It's really about how something lands for you. So, for example, you and Lucas and Miguel, you might have a shorthand where you can say things back and forth to each other, and that might land in a way that feels kind and clear. But let's say, Lucas, you say the exact same thing to me. We don't have that dynamic. I might think, gosh, that was pretty direct. That felt like what we call in our framework, obnoxious aggression, where it's a high challenge, low care. Someone else might not even hear the challenge. And so whether it's our cultural backgrounds, being Puerto Rican, whether it's because we're physicians, we're just intrinsically our own unique individuals. And so part of what we're trying to do is figure out how we can communicate in one-on-one ways. So to go back to the tension between Lucas and Miguel, part of it's understanding like, hey, like, and if you're willing to experiment a little, do you want to experiment a little?
Always.
Always?
I
What do you
want to
think?
experiment because this is news to me.
Yes.
That there is tension between us.
I mean, it's not an
Amy?
unhealthy tension. It's just like a back and forth, It's like a bouncing off of ideas in a very like honest, boom kind of a way, It's like, oh, that sucks. It's like, oh, that's good. Very short. We're not philosophers here.
I hear. Listen, I actually really, really like this. Because at the end of the day, your intellectual progress, your capacity to do new things comes from foundationally adding tools to your thought process that start somewhat mechanically, right? I think here's where you have an issue with this, I think, because I know you a little bit. And you are an absolute radicalist, and you don't like any authority. Okay, you are the epitome of the anti-authority. You don't like people telling you how it's got to be done, and so I think, and this is just a comment. But I think my impression is that you're coming from you're wrongly approaching this because because it's probably already come from the university or who knows who and what office, and so your interpretation already comes biased with, they make us like train on all these like slides, and now apparently they're telling us how we have to speak to each other, right? And so there's already that spectrum, but I see it from Amy's side, which is, hey, we're here to coach. We're here to give you some tools. And at the end of the day, you add your style on it. You add your spin. But I think it's an interesting tool because as she's speaking, I'm thinking in my daily activities, and I think I'm a good leader, but I don't necessarily do this. Like, I don't necessarily think about doing this in a way that I invite the conversation. And of course, I'm going to just put my style on it, right?
Mhm.
Your Puerto Ricanness at the end of the day is how you're going to establish your corn, your maíz. Your corn is going to be very different from your core is going to be very different from the next. Your application, your practicality of it. But at the end of the day, is an exercise that the more you do, the more you get better of it. Am I just bullshitting here, or does that make any sense, Amy, to you?
It makes a lot of sense to me, and I think everyone's going to have their own way into it. And so I think just as like to your point about almost like a thought experiment, a couple thought experiments that we like to do in workshops is after I've shared a story of like a time when I received radical candor, which I can share with you because I think when you think about stories, it starts to, unpack any potential biases we might have. I mean, and the word feedback is very fraught. We all sort of bring to this our own histories and stuff. So I totally get it. I will say you said something really important, Miguel, which is about curiosity. I think if there's one core competency related to the kinds of relationships that we're trying to build is about being almost like radically curious, because when you are curious, there's not going to be judgment there. Like, oh, that's really interesting. They see it this way. Huh. That's really, okay. Lucas sees it that way. That's really interesting. I want to get really curious about that. And Miguel sees it that way. And what is the word? You're a radicalist. Like, what is he saying there? And what does Lucas mean when he says about this or that formula? So part of it's like just being deeply curious. And I look at the curiosity as way, like, I always want to get better, and I always want to help the people around me get better. So it's also in service of being helpful. Am I sharing this guidance with this person to be helpful, or am I sharing it because I'm pissed off and they didn't do it the way that I wanted to do it, et cetera? And so that's kind of like one sort of mindset check is like, am I curious? Am I doing this to be helpful? Another mindset check is if you were to think about, and this is whether it's in your current roles as surgeons, maybe whether when you were going through medical school, who would you actually appreciate getting feedback or guidance from? Like whether it's whether this was another doctor, whether this was a professor, whether it was a peer, it can be really helpful to look at the people that you actually would appreciate hearing feedback from them. Or have you ever gotten Radical Candor? And so maybe what I'll do, if it's helpful, is I'll share a story about when I received some Radical Candor. And as I share it, I'm going to be curious. Like, I want you to kind of reflect on your own experience and see it like, oh, something like that happened to me. I was recently out of business school. And so like any Harvard Business School graduate, I thought I was the greatest thing that had ever come into the business world. So I had just like one or two things to learn about leadership and maybe humility. You're smiling. So if we could read the thought bubbles there. And my background was in marketing and communications. We just launched this new website and had a meeting with the CEO and the CFO. And after the meeting, my boss, Steve, he was the chief marketing officer. He asked how I thought the meeting went. I said, the meeting was amazing. I got this new brand project I wanted. CEO was really happy with what the board was saying, and the CFO was happy with the numbers. I was like, this meeting was great. And Steve was very patient, and he said, congratulations. I know how hard you worked. And then he asked what I thought Brooke and Jenny thought of the meeting. And I was like, Brooke and Jenny thought the meeting was great. Brooke was running the analytics and Jenny was running the content. And Steve nodded, very patient. Then he said, Amy, did you notice that the CEO asked Jenny about the content strategy? She started talking and you interrupted her. And I felt really defensive. I was like, yeah, I interrupted her. She was rambling. CEO's really busy. Like, we don't have time for that. Just kind of like, that's that. And he, again, very patiently nodded. And then he said, Amy, did you notice that the CFO asked Brooke about the numbers and they were right in front of Brooke on the table? You didn't even let Brooke answer. Excuse me, you just jumped right in.
Is this a true story?
It's a true, it's amalgam of two experiences.
Okay.
And I said, because I will say, like, we learn the most through our failures, because at that point, and I don't know your sort of emotional makeups, but I am very sensitive. In fact, in my second grade report card, it said, Amy doesn't like criticism. She cries, so here I am teaching feedback because all of a sudden I started realizing something terrible was happening here, because Steve said, Amy, you didn't even let Brooke answer. You jumped in. And then he asked me this question. He said, did you notice what was happening to them in the last 10 minutes of the meeting? And I was like, I realized I had no idea. I was so focused on the CEO and the CFO. Have you ever been in those meetings? You're just looking at the most important people, the CEO and the CFO. Totally was ignoring my team. Yeah. And Steve said, Amy, Brooke looked like he wanted to throw something. Jenny looked like she wanted to be anywhere but there. And I'm afraid you're going to lose your team. Go check in on them. And so here I am thinking, like, great meeting, I'm the best. And they're furious with me. And so the core principle of Radical Candor is this idea of care personally and challenge directly. And part of why I share that story is, like, in the meeting, the challenge was clear. You're going to lose your team. Check in on them. He really showed up in a way. He was very patient with me. He knows how sensitive I am, but he had the courage to tell me. It would have been so easy for him not to tell me and just be like, congrats. And then, 6 months later, they would have left my team. But I think it's also important, and this is where I want you to also think about the relationships you're building. And as listeners are tuning in, what are those relationship deposits, like the deposit in the relationship bank? One thing that he did, I had a concussion. A very heavy door fell on me when I was traveling on a work trip, and he stayed on the phone with me all night. But the other thing I mentioned about that Search Inside Yourself program, the company I was at, this was before mindfulness was a thing. They didn't want to pay for the training, but Steve found budget. So he was really invested in me and my success. And so even though it hurt in the moment, I knew that he was sharing this feedback. He said his challenge was, I know you can be a great leader, but a great manager lets their people shine. Mm. And so for me, when you look at like that balance of caring and challenge, that was radical candor. And, the stories that we share are often like these big moments, but what we can really think about is in any conversation. And this is where just, again, is like a mental model, like, is there care and is there challenge? And we're not going to be sort of always equidistant on those, but we can start to think about like, am I moving in a direction where there's more care and more challenge, like as we're going through this conversation? And so, you, Lucas, when you were sharing about like, oh, this sucks or that's or whatever the shorthand that you and Miguel have, you have that shorthand so you can go right more to a challenge. But if you didn't have that shorthand, how do you start to build those relationships and build that trust?
I guess it's more, it's again, it's training, right? It's an element that within our construction, we probably do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like we do it in the Puerto Ricanness and the Costa Ricanness, but it is we're situational. We understand what's going on. We're talking about these things, and we're talking about how we're going to make them better, or why we didn't like it, or I'll straight up be like, dude, you're rambling. Like don't don't overly introduce people because we do the intro at the top, so there's no need for you to do that. And we're very hypercritical, but I think it is an unstructured core, right?
Yeah.
But when you go to Dell, and I know this has nothing to do with Dell, basically, disclaimer, nothing to do with your job, but when you're put in a position where, hey, you're now the chief of X, Y, or Z, and you're building this team, and you're going to create this thing, then it's not Miguel in front of you, right? And so then that becomes unnatural. And it's a little bit harder, and it seems to you, personality-wise, is a little organic, and maybe you're easy to give that criticism. But maybe there's people that don't, or sometimes you just have to think about how you structure it and relay it. Adding your own flavor to it.
The part that I find difficult in one of the articles that you send is the understanding how it's received.
Yeah.
I think
yes.
I think that is most.
I'll tell you because I had this question already in the back that I was just waiting for the right time, and I'm gonna just say I think it's the same thing I'm gonna dovetail on this one, which is we've talked, and you obviously talk about the good stuff, but I want to see the flip side. Give me the risk. Like, where are your potential pitfalls as you're going through this? Because I bet you could come and you could have the best intentions in the world, and your delivery sucks.
Yeah.
And you are going to essentially hurt feelings, destroy people, there's all this stuff that could happen. Your radical candor, some people are just not ready for it, or the way that you relay it may be a little bit too tough, right? That love can be too tough if you drop it hard. So I guess that's the same question of both of us.
It's a great question. It's probably actually the most important part of all of this. And we call this the sort of radical candor order of operations is, again, we start by getting it. So even though the story I told was a boss giving me criticism, we actually start, especially if we have some power, if we are leading a team, et cetera, we start actually by asking for feedback. So get it, give it, meaning giving more praise than criticism kind of in general. We want this to be more frequent. We don't want this to just be like an annual performance review. These are ongoing conversations. And then what you're talking about is gauging it. How is what I'm saying landing? And this is why we want this to be in a real time conversation, not breaking up with somebody by text or Slack, because we're not going to see the nonverbals and the body language, right? And, it's all fine. No, so we're not going to do that. And this is where asking questions is really important. And even saying like, hey, let's say you just said I'm going to pick on you guys and see how we can take it. So let's say Lucas says, hey, Miguel, or maybe the flip side, since you just mentioned about your rambling. So let's say, when I said, hey, Lucas, that intro went really long and you were rambling and we didn't have any time for the guest. And just for example. So maybe obnoxious aggression would look like, Lucas, you suck at hosting. Like, just shut up. Nobody wants to hear you. Or, so some of it's like, what does radical candor look like for Lucas if Miguel is saying, you talk too long on the intro? And maybe between the two of you, you already have the shorthand, so it's not a problem. But maybe for someone who's working on your team, asking for feedback and saying, hey, when I gave you that instruction last week, I wanted to know how that landed for you. My intention was to be like, I wanted to be kind and I wanted to be clear. But when I said that thing, really being specific about like in that last meeting that we had, or in that last OR thing, or when I said this, I want to understand how it landed. And then they're probably going to say, oh, it was fine.
Yeah.
Right. Because they're not going to really want to give you criticism, right? They're not going to want to say it. So part of what we want to do is we want to start creating safety so that people can start to give us the kind of criticism that we're looking for. So one way that I like to do this is say, look, if we got like, if I'm going to give myself, a 9 out of 10 on that last, interaction in the OR, et cetera. What's one? Tell me one thing I could do better. And there's a famous story. I think it's maybe from Toyota, a Japanese car manufacturer, where they would actually have to stand in the center after they finished manufacturing, just to like look for any. They needed this, even if the smallest piece of criticism, just to make sure that we're constantly learning. And so if you get that sort of, oh, everything's fine, it doesn't mean that everything's fine. It just might mean that people don't necessarily feel safe doing it. And so when you start to get criticism from the folks that are working for you, treat it like gold. You have got to reward the candor. And one way to reward it is to say, like, hey, and have either of you recently gotten any feedback that would be helpful to share as like an example? Anyone gotten any criticism from the folks that you work with? We can either do this, the two of you, or even more in an OR setting. That would be helpful.
No. I'm actually feeling really bad because I potentially have not created an atmosphere where getting feedback is okay. Like I feel. I'll summarize very quickly, Amy. I left like academics after many years working in hospitals to build what I really wanted to be my own private practice, and now I have, let's say, a team of 15 people, and we have outpatient operations and a bunch of stuff, and we built something really beautiful. And I have on the front end of the week, we have what we call our operational performance rounds, where I task every one of the sub teams to give updates on how things are working. And then at the end of the week, we have a clinical performance rounds where we go over cases and we go over things and journeys that need to be fixed, or patients that are falling off the schedule that need to come. So there's these two emphases. But I don't necessarily think that I've done a good enough job of making the environment safe enough for people to speak up and say, here's something that we need to do better, or here's something that I think you could have done better, Dr. Montero, right? Like, it just doesn't feel like that's ever the case. I do think that I try to be very balanced and giving people props, call outs for good stuff, and bringing, I don't know if radical, but certainly candor, and saying, hey, this is wrong. And and I don't point a finger, but I say there's an opportunity for improvement, right? Like we can't do this again. But I think there's a huge opportunity for improvement here of building that a little bit more of almost like allowing people to step up a little bit more and starting at so I guess in that context, your thoughts on, because it one thing is, hey, I want to coach myself how to be better at this, but how much more amazing is it? Hey, I want to make this part of the culture of my company. And so I want it to not be unilateral. I want this to be a thing that we all get to do to each other, right? Me, front desk, navigator, RCM person, ultrasound technologist. Like there's all these different people that interact on a daily basis. How do you foster this? How do you start by one, like as a leader, and try to permeate it down and find and seek exercises to try to get people to step up and feel good about that? But I guess it takes a huge efforts to do that. But what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, well, first of all, in the terms of public praise, I mean, just that kind of self-awareness, like that is huge. And also just reflecting on your desire to make this, new practice as positive and as high performing and safe as possible, because those two go together. So first of all, like for me, when I hear that reflection, that's huge. There is so much great stuff in the book, Radical Candor. So I certainly encourage you, not only in terms of feedback, but there's really what Kim does in this book that I think is brilliant is that it distills really this new management philosophy, which is that telling people what to do doesn't work, that we really need to collaborate, and that leaders are responsible for three things. One of them is creating this culture of guidance that we've just been talking about, feedback, asking for it, encouraging it, et cetera. But there's also really great information about sort of growth of your team, putting people in the right roles. Some people might be on a very steep performance trajectory. Other people might be in a more steady state, but that's okay. We need those kind of solid performers as well. And so understanding where people are on their, sometimes maybe somebody is, they're building their family or they're wanting to do another side project. And so acknowledging that. And then the third thing is decision-making meetings, getting stuff done. How do we actually make decisions, right? Like who's making the decisions? Are we getting buy-in? Are we going through what we call our sort of get shit done wheel? So there's a lot of great stuff in the book. Our website, radicalcandor.com, has tons of free info. Of course, our podcast, the Radical Candor podcast. But specifically to get started, one of the things that we'll have people do after they do, they'll have a workshop or they'll read the book. We have a, book discussion guide, is start by sharing your stories. So for example, Miguel, what you could do is you could, if you have a weekly staff meeting or whatever it is, and you say, hey, I had this person on from this company called Radical Candor, and she shared her story. And I want us to start looking at how we can create a culture where we are feeling more safe and empowered to help each other grow. And so I want to share a time when, I received Radical Candor or what Radical Candor looks like for me. And so when a leader kind of signals that kind of vulnerability is huge. So that would maybe be kind of thing one, is sharing a story, explaining what it looks like, starting to see what it looks like for other people, and then telling your team, and don't be surprised, I'm going to start asking you for some feedback. And another helpful thing you could do is in your staff meetings is you can start to create a culture. We have an example of whoops-a-daisy, where people kind of own that they made a mistake. And so it's hey, here's a mistake I made last week. Who's going to get the whoops-a-daisies, stuffed animal or whatever it is. I mean, you can do whatever it is in your own culture, but kind of creating an environment where we feel comfortable sort of owning our mistakes. And then in those meetings, we want to have one-on-one conversations. So when you're soliciting feedback, you could do this in a one-on-one setting. You could also do it, as the leader. The leader is the one exception to private criticism. We always want to criticize in private. We can give praise both publicly and privately, because public praise shows people sort of what good looks like why that was a good outcome, how we got there. We want to criticize in private. But as a leader, yeah, it's really important from a safety. It's super important. And so what you can do to kind of model that is, let's say in a one-on-one, you solicited some feedback, you got a piece of criticism, you could say, hey, I heard this week, and you don't need to say who it was from, depends on if they want to share or not, that I was doing this thing in our meetings that was shutting down conversation, right? So I'm working on it. In fact, Kim tells a story in the book where she got feedback that she interrupted a lot. And so to reward the candor, she shows up at the next team meeting and she's wearing, those like rubber bands that go around a broccoli stalk. And she's like, anytime I interrupt, you are allowed to snap the rubber band. Like, it's, just to make the listening, to make the listening tangible. It hurt. I mean, you don't have to go that far with it. But the idea is that you're showing people not only are you open to it, but that you are treating it like gold and rewarding it. Because again, the first few times you start asking, you might not get that. And so when you do start to get it, when you mention it in public, when you start to celebrate it, and then when people can start to do it amongst each other. Because what we don't want to happen is like the meeting after the meeting. That's probably the most toxic of all workplaces. We call that manipulative insincerity. It's like, yeah, let's all do that. Great meeting. And then we go to the side and we're like, I can't believe Miguel just said that we're going to do this, but people didn't feel safe bringing that up in the meeting. And so we're sort of complaining about it in the side. We want people talking to each other, not about each other.
What's the relationship of the concept of radical candor with the concept of hierarchy? Meaning, probably all these models that we create and construct serve some sort of function, and hierarchy probably serves some sort of function. Does it contradict? Does it come in conflict with hierarchy? Where and when it is hierarchy good or tending towards hierarchy good, and when is the conflict that Radical Candor brings good, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Look, hierarchy, it's a construct that we all face, all different types of power, whether it's hierarchical or, sort of role-related power, systemic power that we might have, whether it's around, race or gender, or, if I am a majority or underrepresented, all of these different ways in which we may or may not have power in an organization or our role, or even I'm assuming, in a hospital setting, there's different forms of hierarchies, and maybe certain teams are more, quote, powerful than others. So the reason why Kim wrote the book for managers, the subtitle was, be a kick-ass boss without losing your humanity, was because it really was that we have to counteract that hierarchy, that it is so much harder as a manager or a leader to actually get the kind of criticism, to get the kind of feedback that we need to grow. In fact, I worked at CEO leadership organizations, one called YPO, another one called Vistage, because people have always been like afraid to tell the leader what's really going on, right? So as a leader, we have to very intentionally create the kinds of cultures where we lay that power down so that we in some way start to level the playing field. But knowing that even just the very act that someone is the CEO is going to make us a little nervous. And I'll just like a quick story. Jason Rosoff is our CEO, and this is really like the first company where I do feel fully psychologically safe. I feel like I can, really share what's on my mind. But even so, my negativity bias and my self-critic is pretty strong. So we have a weekly one-on-one meeting. And Jason sent me this note in Slack, and it was like, hey, we don't have our one-on-one this week. We were both really busy. But let's find time this week. I want to, to check in on this project. I have some thoughts. And when I read that, I have some thoughts, like for me, it was like murder mystery music was accompanying that. I was like, I was like, well, I had a good run at Radical Candor. I guess it's all over. It just was like a total negative spiral. So I was trying to manage it. I knew we were going to be talking the next day. And so I said, so Jason, he checked in, wanted to see how I thought the project was going. And then he just was asking questions, and he had some really great ideas. It was such a great conversation. To your point, earlier, Lucas, it wasn't like Amy in the meeting, it wasn't structured in this very formal way of how he said it. You can use core to structure your thinking about what you want to say, but then you're having a conversation with that person. And so it was a conversation. He asked a lot of questions. He shared his perspective. That's really what we're doing. It was super helpful. And then I said, Jason, never again I have thoughts. And I feel safe enough that I can tell my boss that. And he cracked up and he said, the funny thing about that was he had tried multiple times in Slack, like how to actually set that meeting up. And I said, all you need to do is say, hey, I'd love to check in and see how you feel, how this meeting is going. But like, no, and I have thoughts. So all I'm saying to your point of like gauging and how something is going, we're going to mess up, but we build relationship, we build safety and trust when we actually have these kinds of conversations. So my point about hierarchy, just the very act that like, he's my boss, he's the CEO, as safe as I feel, it's still going to bring up some nervousness for me. And so he needs to do everything he can to reward the candor when I give that to him. If he said, tough luck, like that's how I said it, deal with it, like I'm going to start like holding back. I'm still thinking what I'm thinking, but I'm not going to feel as safe and as welcome to share my perspective.
Amy, if anybody out there is tickled by this, interested, wants to learn more, what would be the way to get in touch with you guys? Or are there books, would you advise something? Like what's the way forward here for somebody tickled by this?
Sure. We welcome any and all folks. Check out the Radical Candor podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts.
And then how often does that podcast happen?
We're usually weekly. Sometimes it's every other week, but we try to pull that out weekly. Earlier episodes give more introductory concepts. And then more recently, just to go back to what Lucas was sharing about hierarchy, Kim Scott's latest book is called Radical Respect. And it's really looking at what happens when power weighs into the equation. Because if we do not have respect for each other, we are not going to care personally about them. We are not going to challenge directly. So in many ways, the kind of respect that I see you as a human being, and because that you are a human being just like I am, we are inherently worthy of respect, different than earned respect about, accountability, et cetera, but just the innate nature of us as common human decency. That book is called Radical Respect. We've been talking about some of those issues as well on the podcast. So radicalcandor.com is our website. Lots of free content available. And you can certainly find us on LinkedIn and check out the podcast.
That's really cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy.
This has been really fun. We've unveiled things I didn't know. This tension situation. We may have to have another one-on-one.
We'll have I think we're going to have a follow-up check-in.
Yes, we do. Yeah. I think we're going to have to check in again and see where we're at.
I would love to. I really love the conversation.
Live therapy.
Yeah. But for me, it's seeing the interaction between the two of you. And part of what would be a fun exercise is like, I can sense the care and the trust. And part of what we try to do in the workshops is get to like, what are the specific things that this person does that has created that sense of trust and safety with me? Because like when we start to, I trust him, or like I can, but like, what is it that this person did? Because that starts to help us really get into more specific behaviors, how we can build trust with other folks.
Do you want to share, Lucas, in the next couple of minutes?
They want to share
one example.
Want to say something deep and say why do you feel that you can trust me a lot?
I think like once you are, you go through, it's like when people go into battle together, like when you go and do difficult things together, like we did in residency, that creates a sort of unspoken bond, trust, call it what you say it. So I think that going through that experience builds that trust.
I think I can say anything without reservation to you, no matter how good or bad it is, and that you're not going to pass judgment. Yeah. And that's one thing that I love about you.
And that is truly the definition of psychological safety, what you just shared there. Miguel. Yeah, that's really cool. And one of the beauties of asking for feedback and rewarding that feedback is that it can be, we might not have 10 years in residency to spend. We might need to do this pretty quickly. But if we ask for feedback and reward it, and we listen to what the other person has to say, it can be a quicker path to developing some of that trust and safety.
Well, I think that with that, we will let you go.
All right.
I think Lucas and I have to do couples therapy.
That's right. Well, you got your work ahead of you.
Yeah,
but
we got some work ahead of us.
Feel free to call me in as an impartial third party. I'd be happy to support you.
Amy, thank you for your time. This has been amazing. I hope you have a blessed, beautiful, perfect weekend. And we look forward to having more conversations with you.
I would love it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you both.
All right. Thanks, Amy.
All right.
Everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Two vascular surgeons walk into a bar and come out with a podcast. We are talking everything vascular and not. Welcome to the Life of Flow podcast.